The morning air had a bite to it that made James pull his jacket tighter around his shoulders. 53 years old now, with weathered hands and crow's feet that deepened when he smiled, James Whitaker knew these woods like they were an extension of himself. 30 years of hunting in the Blue Ridge Mountains had taught him to read the forest in ways most people couldn't understand. This particular Thursday morning started like any other hunting day. James woke before the sun, made his coffee strong and black, and packed his small cooler with a simple lunch: 2 ham sandwiches, an apple, and a thermos of hot soup. His wife Betsy was still asleep when he kissed her forehead and whispered he'd be back before dinner. "These old bones feel something different about today," James muttered to himself as he loaded his truck. His dog Tucker, too old now to join the hunts, watched steadily from the porch, tail giving a half-hearted wag. "Don't worry, boy. I'll bring you back something good." The drive to his usual spot took 40 minutes, the truck's headlights cutting through darkness as the radio played soft country music. James hummed along, tapping the steering wheel with calloused fingers. He'd been feeling restless lately, the same trails and hunting spots becoming too familiar. Today, he decided he would push further north, into an area he'd marked on his map, but never properly explored. As he parked and gathered his gear, James noticed the sky. The weather report had promised clear conditions, but dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. He hesitated, considering whether to stick to known territory, but something pulled him toward the unexplored trail. Perhaps it was the simple human need for something new, or maybe it was intuition. Either way, James shouldered his pack and rifle and headed into the trees. The first 2 hours were uneventful. James moved quietly, stopping often to listen and observe. He spotted 3 deer, but none offered a clean shot. The clouds continued to build, turning the forest darker than it should be at mid-morning. The wind picked up, carrying unfamiliar scents that made James wrinkle his nose. "Strange day," he whispered, kneeling to examine some disturbed leaves. Something had passed this way recently, not a deer or bear. The pattern was wrong. James stood, suddenly aware of how quiet the forest had become. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just silence and the growing moan of wind through the trees. He checked his compass and realized he had traveled farther than planned. The terrain was changing subtly, the familiar oak and maple giving way to denser pine. The ground sloped downward toward what might be a ravine or gully he'd never encountered before. James paused to drink from his canteen, feeling oddly unsettled. 30 years in these mountains, and he'd never felt unwelcome until now. He almost turned back, should have turned back. He would think later, but pride or curiosity pushed him forward. The first raindrop hit his hand as he pushed through a thick patch of brambles. Then another. Within minutes, a light drizzle was falling, making the forest floor slick and treacherous. James pulled his rain cover from his pack and continued, moving more carefully now. He followed a natural path between 2 rock formations, entering a small clearing he'd never seen before. And that's when he saw it, something bright and unnatural against the dark earth. Red fabric, partially covered by fallen leaves. James approached slowly, his hunter's instinct making him cautious. He brushed away wet leaves to reveal a backpack, its material worn but clearly not long abandoned. Nearby, a flat area showed signs of what had once been a campsite. The rain was falling harder now, washing away details with each passing minute. "Hello," James called, his voice sounding strangely small in the vast woods. "Anyone here?" Only the increasing patter of raindrops answered him. James crouched beside the backpack, his heart beating faster. Something was wrong here. Very wrong. 30 years of hunting had taught him to read not just the forest, but its disruptions. And everything about this scene spoke of trouble. With the rain now falling steadily, James made a decision that would change everything. Instead of turning back towards safety and home, he unzipped the mysterious backpack. The backpack was heavier than James expected. Rain dripped from his cap as he carefully pulled open the main compartment. Inside, he found clothes, a few t-shirts and a spare pair of jeans, all neatly folded but damp from the rain that had seeped in. A toothbrush wrapped in a small towel. A half-empty bottle of water. Normal things that told him nothing about their owner or what might have happened here. "Hello," James called again, louder this time. The rain swallowed his voice. He stood up, scanning the area more carefully. Now that he was really looking, James could see that something violent had happened at this campsite. The ground around him told a story his eyes had missed at first glance. A fallen tree branch that might have been used as a weapon. A boot print pressed deep into mud, someone running, not walking. And there, partially hidden beneath fallen leaves, the corner of something that looked like a book. James picked it up. A small journal with a blue cover, its pages swollen with moisture but still readable. He flipped it open, feeling like he was stepping into someone else's private world without permission. But if someone was in trouble, those feelings didn't matter. The first page had a name, Alex Bennett. Below it, an emergency contact number and the words, "If found, please call my brother Tom." James pulled out his phone, but the screen showed no signal bars. He was too deep in the woods, and with the storm, there was no chance of making a call. He tucked the phone away and turned back to the journal. The entry started 3 weeks ago. Alex described hiking the Appalachian Trail, taking photos of wildlife, enjoying the solitude. Normal stuff. James flipped forward, scanning quickly. Then the entries changed turn. Day 12. Saw something strange today. Footprints that don't match any hiker's boots. Too big. Going to investigate tomorrow. Day 14. Found an old trail. Not on any map. Going to follow it. Day 15. Can't believe what I found. If I'm right about this, it changes everything. The next pages were filled with excited but cryptic notes about a discovery. Alex mentioned coordinates but didn't explain what was there. Then came the last entry, dated just 2 days ago. Someone's been watching my camp. Saw them through the trees last night. Not a hiker. They had equipment. Going to hide my findings and move to a safer location. If anything happens to me, check the hollow oak at the coordinates. James closed the journal, a sick feeling in his stomach. He looked around the campsite again, seeing it with new eyes. The scattered gear, the signs of a struggle. This wasn't an abandoned camp. Something had happened to Alex. The rain was coming down harbor now, washing away any tracks that might have been left. James knew he should head back, call the rangers, let professionals handle this. That was the smart thing, the safe thing. But the coordinates in the journal, they weren't far from here. Maybe just a mile north, deeper into the unexplored territory. And if Alex was hurt, waiting for help. "Damn it," James muttered, stuffing the journal into his jacket pocket. He gathered what he could from the campsite, the backpack, a small flashlight that still worked, a half-empty water bottle. The rest he covered with large leaves to protect from the rain, marking the spot with a bright orange strip from his hunting vest tied to a tree branch. The smart choice would be to turn around. James knew these woods were dangerous in a storm. Trails washed out. Visibility dropped to nothing. Easy to get turned around, lost. But somewhere out there was a person who might need help. Someone who'd found something important enough to be followed, important enough to be attacked for. James checked his compass, adjusted his pack, and headed north into the deepening storm. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead and ran down his neck, but he barely noticed. His mind was filled with questions about Alex Bennett and what could be so important in these familiar yet suddenly strange woods. With each step, the forest grew darker, as if night were falling hours too early. And through the trees ahead, James thought he saw something move, something too large to be a deer, too quick to be a bear. James froze, his hand instinctively moving to the hunting knife on his belt. The shape he'd spotted vanished behind a cluster of pines, leaving him wondering if his eyes had played tricks on him. After 30 years in these woods, he knew how rain and shadows could turn ordinary things into monsters. Just a deer, he told himself, though he didn't really believe it. Whatever he'd seen had moved with purpose, not the startled dash of frightened wildlife. He pressed forward, using his compass to stay on course toward the coordinates from Alex's journal. The storm intensified, wind whipping through the trees and making them creak and groan. Twice he slipped on the muddy ground, the second time wrenching his knee painfully. "Getting too old for this nonsense," he muttered, rubbing his knee as he leaned against a tree trunk. The light was failing fast, making it harder to pick out safe footing. According to his watch, it was only 2:30 in the afternoon, but the storm clouds had turned day into twilight. James pulled out his flashlight, grateful Alex had packed a decent one. Its beam cut through the gloom, revealing a steep drop ahead where rainwater had carved away part of the trail. He would need to go around, adding time to his journey. As he changed direction, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. That feeling of being watched had returned, stronger than before. James turned slowly, sweeping the flashlight beam through the trees behind him. Nothing, just rain and wind and darkening forest. He continued on, more cautious now, stopping every few minutes to listen. The normal sounds of the forest had returned. Birds calling warnings about the storm, small animals rustling for shelter, but underneath was something else. A deliberate quiet that followed him. The coordinates led him to the edge of a ravine he'd never encountered before. Below, through gaps in the trees, he could make out what looked like a small valley. This far off the established trails, it wasn't surprising he'd never found this place before. What was surprising was the faint but unmistakable glow of light coming from somewhere in that valley. "Someone's down there," James whispered. Getting down would be tricky. The sides of the ravine were steep, made slippery by the rain. In good weather, with proper equipment, it would be challenging. In this storm, with night coming on, it was nearly impossible. James checked his phone again, still no signal. He thought about Betsy at home, probably starting to worry as the hours passed. He thought about turning back, marking the spot on his map, and returning with help. Then a cry echoed up from the valley, not quite human, not quite animal, and James knew he couldn't leave. He searched along the edge of the ravine until he found a place where the slope looked manageable. Using his knife, he cut a sturdy branch to use as a walking stick. Then, step by careful step, he began to make his way down. The descent was brutal. Twice he lost his footing and slid several yards, grabbing at roots and saplings to stop himself. His hands were soon scraped raw, his pants torn at the knees. But foot by foot, he made progress. Halfway down, he paused to catch his breath. The light he'd spotted was clearer now, definitely artificial, definitely coming from some kind of structure. The rain had eased slightly, allowing him to hear other sounds from the valley floor. Metal clanging against metal, the low hum of a generator, and voices. At least 2 people were down there, their words indistinct, but their tone unmistakable. They were arguing. James switched off his flashlight and continued downward in the growing darkness. The risk of being seen now outweighed the danger of slipping. His old hunting instincts took over, each step placed with deliberate care, his breathing controlled and silent. When he finally reached level ground, his legs were trembling with exhaustion. The light source was perhaps a quarter-mile ahead, partially hidden by a stand of ancient pines. James crouched behind a fallen log, taking stock of his situation. He was far from home, in unknown territory, approaching what might be dangerous people. His wife didn't know where he was. No one did. "What the hell am I doing?" he asked himself. But then he remembered the torn campsite, the journal entries, the cry he'd heard. Someone needed help. And like it or not, he was the only one here to give it. James took a deep breath, checked that his knife was loose in its sheath, and moved forward through the shadows. The forest floor was a maze of shadows and rain-slick leaves. James moved like a ghost between the trees, placing each foot with the care of a man who knew that noise meant danger. The light ahead grew stronger, not the warm yellow of a campfire, but the harsh white of electric lamps. As he drew closer, the source became clear. A small clearing held what looked like a research station. 2 prefabricated buildings, each about the size of a shipping container, sat side by side. A gas generator hummed nearby, powering bright floodlights that created a circle of harsh daylight in the stormy darkness. James crouched behind a fallen tree, studying the scene. A mud-splattered truck was parked beside the buildings. Not a ranger vehicle or forest service truck. This was a private rig with oversized tires and blacked-out windows. The kind city folks bought to look tough, not the kind working people used. The arguing voices came from inside the larger building. Through its windows, James could see shadows moving, at least 3 people. He strained to hear their words over the patter of rain and the generator's rumble. "Told you he had proof." A man's voice, angry and sharp. "We don't know that." Another man, calmer but just as firm. "We haven't found anything yet." "Because you let him get away. He could be calling the Rangers right now." "No phone signal for 20 miles, and he won't get far with that leg." James's heart thumped harder. They had to be talking about Alex. He was alive but hurt, somewhere out in this storm, running from these men. But why? A door slammed, and James ducked lower as someone stepped outside. A tall man with a bushy beard stomped across the clearing, lit a cigarette, and stared into the darkness. He wore a camo jacket that had never seen real hunting just for show. A handgun was tucked into his belt, illegal during hunting season. "We should just pack up," the men called back toward the building. "Cut our losses." "Not until we find him," came the reply from inside. "And what he took from us." James shifted his weight, trying to ease the cramp forming in his leg. A twig snapped beneath his boot. The bearded man spun around, hand moving to his gun. "Who's there?" James held his breath, pressing himself flat against the wet ground. "Probably just a deer," someone called from the doorway. "Come back inside. We need to plan our search for tomorrow." The bearded man took one last look around, flicked his cigarette into the rain, and went back inside. The door closed behind him. James stayed frozen for several long minutes, heart pounding so loud he was sure they could hear it even inside the building. When he finally dared to move, it was only to edge backward, away from the clearing. He needed to find Alex before these men did. The journal had mentioned a hollow oak tree where something important was hidden. That was the key to understanding what was happening here. As James retreated into the sheltering darkness, his foot caught on something soft. He looked down, expecting a fallen branch or clump of moss. Instead, his flashlight revealed a dirty blue backpack, different from the one he'd found earlier. This one was partially hidden under a bush, as if someone had stashed it in a hurry. James knelt and carefully opened it. Inside was camera equipment, expensive stuff. A long-range lens, memory cards, and a small laptop computer sealed in a waterproof bag. He glanced back toward the buildings. Whatever Alex had discovered, it was worth chasing him for, worth hurting him for. Taking the backpack with him, James continued away from the clearing until he felt safe enough to stop and examine his find more closely. He pulled out the laptop and opened it, praying it still had battery. The screen glowed to life, asking for a password. "Dane," James whispered. Then he remembered the journal. He pulled it from his pocket, flipping through the damp pages for any clue that might help. On the inside back cover, almost too faded to read, was a scribbled note. Password: Blue Mountain 2024. James typed it in. The screen changed, revealing a folder labeled EVIDNC. His hands shook as he clicked it open, and then, as the images filled the screen, James finally understood why someone would be willing to kill over what Alex Bennett had discovered in these mountains. "Oh my God," he breathed, staring at the photos. "They're real. They're actually real." The photos on the screen left James speechless. They showed a family of eastern cougars, a mother and two cubs, animals that were supposed to have disappeared from these mountains over 100 years ago. The images were crystal clear, taken with professional skill. The big cats moved through a hidden valley not far from where he now sat. But it was the next set of photos that made his blood run cold. They showed men, the same men in the buildings, setting up traps. Cruel, illegal snares designed to catch the rare animals alive. One picture showed a cage in the back of their truck with something moving inside. The final photos were the most stunning. The bearded man counting money. Another man talking on a satellite phone. A third making notes in a book with foreign writing on the cover. Wildlife traffickers, James whispered to himself. Alex had stumbled onto an illegal exotic animal smuggling operation. The eastern cougar would be worth a fortune to private collectors overseas. The laptop battery indicator blinked red. James quickly checked the remaining files. There was a video file taken just 2 days ago according to its timestamp. He clicked play. The image showed Alex himself, a young man with glasses and a worried expression. He spoke quietly, often glancing over his shoulder. "My name is Alex Bennett. I'm a wildlife photographer documenting the return of the eastern cougar to the Blue Ridge Mountains. 3 days ago, I discovered these men capturing a cub." His voice shook. "They've spotted me. I think they're following me. If anything happens, this evidence needs to reach the Forest Service and the Fish and Wildlife authorities." The video ended as Alex looked suddenly alarmed at something off camera. The laptop screen went black as the battery died. James sat in the darkness, rain dripping from the trees around him, trying to process what he'd learned. Alex was out there somewhere, hurt and hiding. These men were dangerous, and now James held evidence that could put them in prison for years. A crack of thunder shook the forest. The storm was getting worse, not better. James needed shelter, somewhere to think and plan. He remembered Alex's journal mentioning a hollow oak where he hidden something. That might be a good place to start looking for the young photographer. But where was this tree? The journal coordinates had led to the research station, not a hiding place. James flipped through the journal again, looking for any clue. On a dog-eared page, he found a rough map drawn in pencil. It showed the research station and about half a mile to the east, a creek that led to a circle marked Old Oak. Packing everything carefully into the backpack, James set off eastward, using his compass to guide him. The forest was pitch black now, his flashlight beam barely cutting through the heavy rain. Twice he had to stop and take shelter when lightning struck too close for comfort. The creek was swollen with rainwater, turning what should have been a gentle stream into a rushing torrent. James followed it upstream, fighting against mud that sucked at his boots with every step. His legs ached, his hands were raw from scrapes, and hunger gnawed at his stomach. He hadn't eaten since his hasty breakfast many hours ago. Should have stayed home with Betsy and the dog, he grumbled, but kept moving. Someone's life depended on him now. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes, James spotted it, an enormous oak tree, ancient and gnarled, its massive trunk split down the middle by some long-ago lightning strike. The hollow space inside was big enough for a man to stand in. James approached cautiously, sweeping his flashlight beam across the ground. Fresh footprints led to and from the tree. Someone had been here recently. He stepped into the hollow, shining his light around the inside. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then his beam caught a glint of something metallic near the base of the trunk. James knelt and brushed away layers of wet leaves to reveal a small metal box, the kind used for cash or valuables, wired to something that looked disturbingly like. "Oh no," James breathed, his heart skipping a beat. It was attached to a homemade alarm, and he just triggered it. Somewhere in the distance, a shrill electronic beeping cut through the sound of rain and thunder. The beeping alarm sent a jolt of panic through James. He grabbed the metal box, yanking it free from the wires. Inside were several more memory cards, waterproof bags containing documents, and a small GPS device. He shoved everything into his pockets and the backpack, then looked frantically for somewhere to hide. Voices carried through the storm, men shouting, getting closer. They'd heard the alarm or were tracking its signal. Either way, he had minutes, maybe seconds. James squeezed out of the hollow oak and looked up. The ancient tree's branches spread wide, offering a possible escape route. He hadn't climbed a tree since he was a boy, but fear gives even old muscles new strength. Gripping the rough bark, he hauled himself up into the lowest branches, scraping his arms and tearing his jacket. Rain pelted his face as he climbed higher, finding a spot where thick foliage might hide him from people looking up from the ground. The backpack made climbing awkward, but he couldn't risk leaving it behind. The evidence inside was too important. Below, flashlight beams cut through the darkness. Two men approached the hollow oak, their voices clear despite the storm. "The alarm came from here," said a gruff voice James recognized as the bearded man. "Check inside the tree," ordered another. "He might have left more cameras." James held his breath, pressing himself against the tree trunk, willing himself to become invisible in the shadows. His foot slipped on the wet branch, sending a small shower of water droplets and a twig falling to the ground. The bearded man looked up. "There's someone in the tree." A flashlight beam swept upward, momentarily blinding James. Then came a sound that turned his blood to ice, the distinctive click of a gun being cocked. "Come down now," called the second man, "or I'll shoot you out of there." James frantically weighed his options. He could try climbing higher, but the upper branches might not hold his weight. He could try jumping to another tree, but in this rain he'd likely fall. Or he could give himself up and hope they didn't shoot him on sight. None of those options ended well. A blinding flash of lightning split the sky, followed instantly by an earth-shaking crack of thunder. One of the men below cried out in alarm. In that moment of distraction, James saw a third figure dart between the trees, someone small and quick, moving with purpose. "Look out!" shouted the bearded man, but too late. A loud thwack echoed through the forest, and one of the men crumpled to the ground. The second spun around, his gun wavering between the trees and James's perch. "Who's there?" he yelled, panic clear in his voice. Another flash of lightning revealed a young man wielding a heavy branch like a baseball bat. Despite a makeshift bandage on his leg and mud covering most of his clothes, he moved with surprising speed. Alex Bennett was very much alive and fighting back. The bearded man fired wildly, the gunshot nearly lost in another roll of thunder. Alex ducked behind a tree, then darted out again, swinging his branch. The man dodged, but slipped in the mud. His gun flew from his hand, disappearing into the wet undergrowth. James seized his chance. He half climbed, half fell from his hiding place, landing heavily on the forest floor. Pain shot through his ankle, but he forced himself upright. He grabbed a fallen branch of his own and advanced on the bearded man, who was scrambling in the mud for his lost weapon. "Don't move," James growled, pressing the end of his branch against the man's chest. "It's over." Alex limped forward, breathing hard. His face was scratched and bruised, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "You found my evidence," he said, nodding at the backpack. "Yeah," James replied, keeping the branch firmly in place as the bearded man glared up at him. "But we've got a problem. There's at least one more guy back at that camp, and I don't think he's just going to let us walk out of here." Alex's face hardened. "I know, that's the boss. The one who shot me when I tried to escape. He pulled something from his pocket, a set of keys. But I grabbed these when I ran. They can't start their truck without them." James couldn't help but smile despite the danger. "Smart kid. But we still need to get out of these woods alive, and I think I have a plan." Dawn broke over the mountains with pale fingers of light stretching through the clouds. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a forest dripping with rainwater and morning dew. Birds called to each other, reclaiming their territory after the long silence of the storm. James and Alex crouched behind a fallen pine tree, watching the research station. They had bound and gagged the two men from the night before, hiding them securely in the hollow oak. Now they waited, watching for the leader, the last man standing between them and safety. "There," Alex whispered, pointing to movement near the main building. A stocky man with close-cropped gray hair stepped outside, stretching. He looked ordinary, like someone's uncle or high school teacher, not a dangerous wildlife smuggler. But the gun holstered at his hip told a different story. "He's looking for his buddies," James murmured. "Won't be long before he comes searching." Their plan was simple but risky. Using the truck keys Alex had stolen, they would drive to the nearest ranger station, about 30 miles away according to the GPS. The truck had a radio they could use to call for help once they got high enough to get a signal. The problem was getting to the truck without being seen. "Ready?" James asked, checking that the backpack with all the evidence was secure. Alex nodded, his face pale but determined. His injured leg had been rebandaged with strips torn from James's spare shirt, but he still couldn't move quickly. "Remember," James said, "if anything goes wrong, you run for the truck. Don't wait for me." They began moving slowly through the underbrush, circling toward the back of the camp where the truck was parked. James led the way, testing each step to avoid making noise. His hunter's skills were proving useful in ways he'd never imagined. They were 20 yards from the truck when a twig snapped loudly under Alex's foot. Both men froze. "Who's there?" The leader's voice rang out, followed by the sound of his gun being drawn. James looked at Alex and mouthed one word: "Go." Then he stood up and stepped into the open, hands raised. "Just me," he called, "a hunter who got lost in the storm." The gray-haired man stared at him, gun pointed steadily at James's chest. "You're lying. Where are my men?" "Don't know what you're talking about," James said, taking a careful step forward. "I've been walking all night, trying to find my way out of these woods." From the corner of his eye, James could see Alex limping toward the truck, staying low and using the buildings for cover. "Stop right there," the man ordered, his fingers tightening on the gun. "I know you're not alone. My men radioed about an alarm before they went silent." James took another step forward, drawing the man's attention fully to him. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I just need directions to get back to the main trail." The man's eyes narrowed. He was too smart to be fooled for long. "You're the hunter who'd found Bennett's campsite, aren't you? Where's the evidence he collected?" Behind the man, Alex had reached the truck. James heard the faint click of a door opening. "I don't know any Bennett," James said, "and I don't know anything about evidence." The man's face hardened. "Last chance. Tell me where." The truck engine roared to life. The man spun around, firing a wild shot that shattered the windshield. Alex ducked low in the driver's seat but kept his foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward, heading straight for the gray-haired man. James seized his chance. He lunged forward, tackling the man from behind. They hit the ground hard, the gun skidding away into the mud. The man was strong, twisting beneath James, landing a solid punch to his ribs that left him gasping. The truck skidded to a stop nearby. "James!" Alex shouted. "Come on!" With a final surge of strength, James slammed his fist into the man's jaw, stunning him long enough to scramble away. He limped to the truck and hauled himself into the passenger seat. "Go!" he yelled. Alex floored the accelerator. The truck bounced over the rough ground, crashing through underbrush as they headed up the old logging road that led out of the valley. In the side mirror, James could see the gray-haired man struggling to his feet, retrieving his gun. But they were already out of range, the trees swallowing them as the truck climbed higher into the mountains. "We did it," Alex said, his voice cracking with relief. "We actually did it." James leaned back in his seat, every muscle in his body aching. "Not yet. But we will."